I'm Tracy Nicholas, and my co-host Tanya Carwyn and I are passionate folklore practitioners. To us, folkloring is more than a podcast. It's our commitment to help you connect with your roots and awaken the wisdom within you. Hi everyone, Tracy here. I just wanted to pop on before we get into the episode itself to make a quick announcement. As Tanya is living that homesteading lifestyle, sometimes her internet is a little wonky, and the internet gods did not smile on us on the day we recorded this episode. We considered not releasing it, but we really love this content, and so we edited the best we could and sincerely hope the sound quality doesn't mar your enjoyment of the episode.
Welcome to this episode of the Folkloring Podcast. Today we are going to be talking about folk Catholicism, and we're going to especially be looking at the ways in which folklore and pre-Christian traditions were preserved under that mantle. Folk Catholicism is the blending of traditional Catholic practices and local, indigenous, and cultural, religious, or folklore elements. But before we get into that, Tracy, how have you been folkloring lately?
Well, I have a couple of things. At the time that we're recording this, it's spring, and the fiddleheads have just come up. And I have not ever gone and, gathered them, but because I wasn't sure, because some kinds are toxic and some aren't. Mm-hmm. But I did my research and found out that the ones in my yard are perfectly fine to eat. Got a great harvest of those in and cooked them up, and they were amazing. They're so delicious.
They're really good, yeah.
Yeah, I parboiled them first, and then I just sauteed them in olive oil, and it was fantastic.
That's awesome.
I was really excited about it, and very excited to find out that I could eat the ones in my yard without fear of toxic poisoning. Now, the other thing that I have was sort of a last-minute decision, and based on what we're going to be talking about today. And so, as you know, I'm a huge fan of oracle cards, and I had pulled a couple of decks to talk about these particular decks that are based in, Catholic tradition. And so I thought, wouldn't it be fun today, instead of pulling from my regular deck that I almost always use, to pull from one of these decks that I pulled? So I pulled from a deck that is based on the Archangel Michael.
Nice.
And all of the cards, different bits of wisdom. And so I pulled 3 cards today. The first is This Is Your Life's Purpose, which was pretty exciting considering the fact that we're recording today. So, here's to hoping that one is accurate. The next one is The Person You're Asking About Is Trustworthy. I won't mention who that person that I was thinking about is, but that is, again, good news. So that was pretty exciting. And the last one, it was Let Go of Fear Now. And there's a little prayer with each of these. And so this prayer is, Michael, please help me feel safe and deserving of your guidance. Thank you for clearing me of heavy, toxic, or ego-based thoughts or feelings. So I thought that was a pretty fun little reading for me today.
For sure. It sounds like a fun deck, too.
Yeah, it's a great deck.
Yep.
And so what about you, Tanya? How have you been folkloring?
Well, so as you said, it's spring as we're recording this, and it's been crazy town for me here, mostly outside with the garden. So there's been a lot of collecting some of the spring flowers. Like we have a really nice, huge, healthy patch of pedicularis, which is a semi-parasitic plant that grows mostly on the East Coast, I think up into Canada. And I have picked it to tincture, and I've picked a little bit for making oils. It's a skeletal muscle relaxant.
Nice.
And it also has a lot of folkloric elements to it. Like one of the things is that it makes marriages better. It's protectant, and lots of things like that. Another thing is that we just harvested our first few ripe strawberries, which is like borders on a religious experience for us. And some always get offered to our tree for the land spirits and the ancestors and stuff. So and for the rest, it's been like really feeling into kind of a agricultural lifestyle, trying to grow food and plants and herbs for the family.
Nice. Yeah, it's a little too early here for me to plant. But within the next 2 weeks, I will. So that's probably what I'll be talking about next time.
Yeah.
It's too risky that we'll still get frost.
Mm.
Anyhow, so shall we talk about folk Catholicism?
Yeah, let's do it. And first, let's acknowledge the huge amounts of suffering that have been caused and continue to be caused by the Catholic Church as an institution. So, yeah, that is definitely something that I want to acknowledge before we go into this. A lot of the conversions that happened throughout the ages were through force or under coercion. And of course, we strongly reject those practices. And I personally, the church as an organization as a whole. Having said that, also, I want to acknowledge that a lot of former Catholics may carry trauma around the church. And yeah, if this is too much for you, maybe, check out one of the other episodes.
Yeah, definitely self-care is key. And if you do have trauma and this is something that is not enjoyable for you to think about, we have plenty of other episodes for you to get into.
Yes.
I agree with you that there is a lot of trauma. I am not a churchgoer myself. I have all the respect for people who do enjoy that, and that is part of their faith tradition. It is not mine, but yeah.
Yeah. And it's interesting to see like how many people nowadays are really looking into Catholicism from what looks to me like an almost pagan worldview. And definitely like lots of folk practitioners include folk Catholicism into their practices, which I find one of the reasons why we wanted to do this episode. I find that so interesting, and it definitely turns out that under the veneer, I guess, of Catholicism, a lot of pre-Christian traditions and other folk traditions, whether they were pre-Christian or not, have been preserved. And so I think that's worth a look at.
Sure.
The first thing I want to look at is a little bit of the history of conversion. And what turns out is that it's interesting the way conversion was accomplished has an influence on how folk Catholicism is practiced currently. The manner and the timeline of the conversion to Catholicism have influenced the retention and adaptation of indigenous practices within folk Catholicism. So in regions where conversion was more forceful and earlier, such as in parts of Latin America, you see a lot of syncretism, and that served as a form of resistance and preservation of these pre-Christian beliefs. And in contrast, areas that were converted later, like some parts of Africa and the Pacific, they often retained more overt elements of their indigenous religions. And of course, it stands to reason that that would be the case, but I personally hadn't really looked at it in that way. And you can see it in Europe, for example, as well, where areas that were converted earlier have retained less of their indigenous folkways than areas that were converted later.
Well, I wouldn't have thought about it, but it makes sense because, as time goes on, people were traveling more and communication was better. So it wasn't just coming in and saying, we're taking you over completely and do as we say, or we'll kill you and torture you.
Right.
And so it makes sense to me.
And it's also interesting to notice that if conversion was mostly fueled by political aims, you see then the upper classes get a veneer of Catholicism, but the peasants more or less continued on with their folk practices, at least for a while.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So just a very quick overview of the conversions. The first century of the Common Era, Christianity begins in the Roman province of Judea with the teachings of Jesus Christ around 30 of the Common Era. And then it spreads from there to the Eastern Mediterranean. Then the second to the third century, you see it in the Roman Empire with a gradual spread. Fourth century, Emperor Constantine converts to Christianity, and then it was declared the state religion in the Roman Empire. The 5th through the 7th century, it reaches Britain and Ireland and some of the Germanic tribes. From the 8th to the 11th century, you see it in Scandinavia and some in Eastern Europe. The 13th through the 15th century, it reaches the Baltic regions and also in the Americas. from the 15th to the 17th century, obviously brought by European colonizers.
Right.
And we see it in Philippines and parts of Asia. And then in the 18th to the 20th century, there were widespread missionary efforts across Africa and Oceania. So that's a very broad overview of the spread.
Yeah, but amazing to just see it take over the world like that
Yeah,
in a quick snapshot.
yeah, pretty interesting. So let's move on to look at some of the roots of folk Catholicism.
Hmm.
We need to look at a concept which is religious syncretism, and folk Catholicism often emerges as a result of religious syncretism, which means where traditional local beliefs and practices were integrated with the formal Catholic doctrines brought by missionaries usually.
Hmm.
The syncretism was sometimes a grassroots adaptation to make the new religion more relatable and acceptable to local preservations. And within that, it preserved pre-Christian or non-Christian traditions within a Christian framework.
Yeah, I think it's important to point out, though, that this is not the same. Every time a major holiday comes around, a major Christian holiday comes around, you see people like, oh, this is based on a pagan holiday.
Mhm.
And this is a fine point, but I think it's an important distinction that this is not Christian holidays usurping older pagan holidays. It is more giving an alternative to those, often calendar-based holidays, and so they happen around the same time. So people still have something to celebrate. And taking over
Mhm.
some of those, local grassroots kinds of practices, they can look similar, but it's not the same. And I really reject that idea that, all the Christian holidays are older pagan holidays. It really just didn't work that way.
Right. Some of these forms have come to be identified as separate religions, as in the case with Caribbean or Brazilian syncretism between Catholicism and West African traditions. So we're talking about things like Haitian voodoo, Cuban Santeria, Brazilian candomblé, which are now considered separate religions, but sort of arose out of a meeting of worlds,
Okay.
right, between Catholicism and traditional religions.
Right.
You kind of see the same, a similar syncretism happens between Catholic practices and indigenous or Native American belief systems. And you see that commonly in Mayan communities of Guatemala and Quechua communities of Peru. But they're not typically considered separate religions. Their practitioners generally regard themselves as Catholics.
Yeah, I think that, you see a lot of Catholics that they have, more magical practices but they still consider themselves, like you say, good Catholics.
Right. So we also have to talk about regional variations of folk Catholicism, and that's definitely one of the interesting points of folk Catholicism is that it is not a one size fits all. It's very local and particular to a group of people, and it can differ significantly from one region to another. Obviously influenced by local customs, but also historical developments and the extent of isolation from central ecclesiastical authority. So, how close the church was or the church leaders were to your village or your region affected how much you could deviate, I guess, from church doctrine.
Right. I suppose that also just not even just being in different regions would create these differences, but I would say that variations will also occur based on where immigrants are coming from. Because oftentimes, at least in America, when the immigrants were coming in, a lot of people would settle in the same place that came from the same place.
Right.
There were a lot of Swedish and Norwegian immigrants that came to the upper Midwest and they came to work in the logging industry. And so, they
Mm-hmm.
brought those practices with them. So I think that when you look at where traditional beliefs were fused with Catholic ones, as you were talking about earlier, I found an example of something called the Mandinga pouches in Brazil. And there
Mm-hmm.
was a series of Inquisition trial records that led anthropologists to discover that these pouches were a combination of an African Islamic tradition,
Mhm.
and they contained passages of the Quran. It also included the European tradition of wearing printed or written prayers mixed in with occult symbols and indigenous amulets.
Interesting.
Fusing all of those things together, and of course, then the Inquisition comes in, right?
Yeah,
But yeah, so we had good records of what those were made of and how those fused all of these different cultures.
that sounds so wonderful. Now, let's move on to looking at the historical and political context.
Sure.
The development of folk Catholicism was also influenced by historical and political context, of course. For
Hmm.
instance, in colonial settings where Catholicism was introduced alongside European rule, the adaptation of local customs into Catholic practices was a way for indigenous populations to preserve their culture and identity under colonial domination. And we have talked about that in our episode on folklore is resistance. And more, we've looked at that in more depth in that episode.
Yeah, we talked about how the slaves or other disenfranchised people would disguise their spiritual practices so the class in power wouldn't be aware of it. And so a lot of times they would translate to Catholic names of saints and superimpose the talking about like Mother Mary or what have you about over these older spiritual practices, and that was a way of hiding that they were preserving those traditions.
Absolutely. Now, the church as an organization had a varied acceptance of these practices. The church's response to folk Catholicism was in certain circumstances, local practices were tolerated by the clergy as a pragmatic way of encouraging conversion and acceptance of Christianity. And in other cases, such practices were met with resistance and deemed superstitions or heretical, leading to efforts to purify religious practices and enforce orthodoxy. And you see that especially during periods like the Counter Reformation.
Hmm.
The Catholic Church seems rather accepting of many expressions of folk Catholicism, but it's not actively endorsing or rejecting things like folk saints, apparitions, and things like that. In certain cases, they're very, very outspoken against it, the churches. One such example is the cult of Santa Muerte from Latin America.
Yeah, I think that it's interesting. I remember when you'd hear about, oh, the church is investigating this miracle, or like, is this statue crying, and all of that. Now, I don't think I've heard of many of those lately, and maybe that's just part of the church kind of backing off of legitimatizing those things.
Yeah, and or the opposite, right? Like if you don't accept, because like canonizing takes forever, like hundreds of years often before somebody is declared a saint.
Right.
So if you just leave things be, then it's all a little murky, and people can still be Catholics but pray to a saint that's really a folk saint and not really canonized into the Catholic Church itself.
Yeah, I know that there is an underpass in Chicago that supposedly has an image of the Mother Mary.
Mm.
No word on how the church feels about that yet, though.
And it seems also just it's hard for the church to, even if they say this is not a saint and it's just a folk saint, it doesn't really count.
Mhm.
It doesn't seem to affect people's veneration of these saints. So, why bother really?
Right, right. Well, and you got to wonder to yourself, why is it that Jesus always shows up on food like toast? Like, why that choice? I don't know. I'd love to talk to Jesus about that and see why that is his preferred method of appearance.
That's fun.
Okay, so other things that I found, I want to talk a little bit about some of the beliefs about the Bible that went sort of beyond the Catholic Church,
Hmm.
because there's always been a belief that the Bible held magical powers and was a spell book. And a lot of people would use them as a protective talisman, put it under their pillow to protect from witches or evil spirits. People still touch the Bible when swearing an oath.
Uh-huh.
And so there's that power behind it. And There was also, they used the Bible for divination. You would place a key in a Bible at certain passages and bind the Bible up with the key in whatever passage that you wanted to get the power from, and then suspend it. And you could say, if you're trying to figure out who stole something from you, you would say different names of people you suspected, and the power of the Bible would make it turn, as it was, hanging, turn around in response to the name of the actual thief.
Wow.
People would take passages written on scraps of paper, use them for healing spells, and even Psalms, reading Psalms as spells. And for me,
Mhm.
the book of Psalms is a spell book. That's exactly the way I
Yeah.
use it. I use Psalms in my practice. And so I think that books have always been seen as powerful objects. Well, maybe not always, but books in a lot of ways are seen as powerful objects, and ones that are particularly scholarly are seen as powerful. But because this one is a religious tome or religious tomes, that was particularly powerful in many people's eyes, even if they weren't part of that religion, that those books were still valued for their magical, mystical properties.
Uh-huh.
And, as you were talking earlier, as Christianity was spreading across Europe, it's very interesting because the natives that were being converted, they saw the Bible as an occult source of power. And in parts of Africa, South America, the Caribbean, and the South Pacific, there's widespread belief that the white man deliberately withheld the full power of Christianity to keep them in subjugation.
Hmm.
The belief was they did this by withholding parts of the quote unquote true Bible, and therefore the full key to wisdom, knowledge, and power. And where this belief came from, there were lots of contenders for things that were going to be included in the Bible.
Right.
So they had to select which pieces of spiritual writing they were going to put in the Bible. And this was a very selective process, and it was a very political process. And it
Yeah.
resulted in the final compilation, right?
Right.
So the passages that didn't get in the Bible, of course, those were the rejected texts, and they included stories, gospels, histories, and different events. And this, quote, alternative Bible text were believed to be part of the whole Bible, and that there was magic traditions in these other texts because these stories got out, and it was like, well, this wasn't in the Bible, but here's this religious story.
Right.
And so people found out that there were other parts of the Bible that apparently these men, because of course they were men, that selected the texts that went in, had access to all these other texts that other people didn't know about. So I thought that was really fascinating, that belief came, that there was like a bigger Bible that only like the white man knew about.
What is interesting is that you see sort of that sentiment still to these days, right? Like we talk about Dead Sea Scroll or Enochian writings, things like that. Like people are still saying like there's like more powerful wisdom, probably more magical stuff is available in these other texts that just never made it into the Bible.
Right. How many pop culture movies do you see where people are trying to search out for, some magical passages that have been lost to time, and they're, hunting through the clues to get to them?
Yeah.
We believe that there are these lost texts that have power, and it's a great fantasy to think about if we could find these texts.
Right. If you realize the devastation that was caused by the burning of the library in Alexandria, right? Like
Right.
so much was lost.
Yeah.
And then, yeah, but they just found the Dead Sea Scrolls like in their lifetime. So I also find that interesting. I'm also really interested in direct translations from the Aramaic or earlier languages of Bible texts and things like that, because it's, lost in translation for sure, especially if you have a lot of political powers pulling in certain directions.
Right. I mean, who's ever doing the translating is really putting their spin on what those original texts were. because they can choose this word over that word and misinterpret and reinterpret. And you hear about stories being completely changed when they were translated. And so that person, who ever does the popular translation, has a lot of power.
Yeah, and the translation isn't like, oh, it was written in Aramaic and now from the Aramaic we translated to English. It was from Aramaic to Hebrew to Greek to Latin and maybe then to English, right?
Right. It's like a big spiritual game of telephone.
Exactly. And I'm curious to know what other tidbits of information may be available if we were able to have direct translations out of, and we are, you're right, people are doing that.
And the other thing is that language is living and it changes over time.
Yep.
So words that we have today may mean something just very different than the way that they were originally using some of these words.
Absolutely. Well, let's move on and look at some examples around the globe of folk Catholicism that is still practiced to this day.
Right.
So one of the things that we see in mostly Northern Europe, we see midsummer celebrations, and it's celebrated around the feast day of St. John the Baptist, June 24th. And this celebration incorporates pre-Christian solstice traditions, including bonfires, which are often considered a remnant of ancient fire rituals meant to boost the sun's energy halfway through its yearly cycle, also to ward off evil spirits and in general to purify. The integration of these practices into Christian festivals highlights the syncretic nature of folk Catholicism in Europe, where pagan customs were Christianized to facilitate the acceptance of the new religion.
Right.
In Mexico and other parts of Latin America, you see a veneration of the Virgin of Guadalupe. Its Catholicism there is very deeply intertwined with indigenous beliefs, and the cult of the Virgin of Guadalupe is a prime representation where the Virgin Mary is seen as a continuation of the Aztec goddess Tonantzin.
Mm-hmm.
I hope I pronounced that right, but my Aztec isn't great. Of course, we all know Dia de los Muertos in Mexico. It's celebrated November 1st and 2nd. This festival blends indigenous Aztec rituals with Catholic All Saints and All Souls Days. So families create altars to honor deceased loved ones, offering food, marigolds, and sugar skulls.
It's very interesting because, we've got the whole sort of now more secular Halloween where it's like, oh, the veil is thin. So you see a lot of that October 31st, November 1st, looking at the Day of the Dead. So I think that that's an interesting blending of those beliefs.
Yeah, my assumption was that November 1st and 2nd were European, or like November 1st were European Day of the Dead celebrations, which were then taken over by the Catholic Church to become All Souls and All Saints Day, which then made its way to Latin America, where it then became syncretized to their own native rituals.
Right.
And the African diaspora, African deities have been syncretized with Catholic saints. So religions such as Santeria in Cuba, Voodoo in Haiti, and Candomblé in Brazil, they feature deities or orishas that correspond to Catholic saints. This syncretism was a strategy by enslaved Africans to retain their religious practices under the guise of Catholic worship. And over time, these religions have evolved into very rich and complex systems of belief that signify resistance and adaptation rather than mere survival.
It's interesting. One of the decks that I pulled for today, as I was talking about earlier, it's called Goddess Guidance Oracle Cards. And it's different goddesses from around the world. And the reason that I pulled it is because two of the cards in the deck, one is Mary Magdalene, which that card is about unconditional love. And then another is Mother Mary. And that one is, not surprisingly, expect a miracle. But I thought it was so interesting that we don't talk about Mary Magdalene or Mother Mary as goddesses, but they were included in this deck sort of equal to all of these other goddesses that
Uh-huh.
are from around the world.
Yep.
And so I thought that was really interesting that, we're talking a little bit the other way of bringing them as goddesses and considering them as goddesses. And I guess it's not that much different as considering, saints, right?
Yeah, it's definitely interesting. You see it kind of in a new agey sort of circles, I guess, nowadays, where the Virgin Mary veneration is kind of big,
Mm-hmm.
which, like, it's cool. Philippines, we have the Sambil Festival that's held annually on the third Sunday of January. And this festival honors the Santo Niño, which means the Holy Child. One of the key elements of this celebration is a particular dance step. And this gave me goosebumps. There's a particular dance step part of this celebration. It's 2 steps forwards and 1 step back that symbolizes the flow of the local river. Very animist, of course. And
Yeah.
according to historical accounts, the people had already performed dances similar to this one to honor animist idols long before the introduction of Christianity to the Philippines.
Huh. That's fascinating. And you're right, very animist.
Very fascinating.
Yeah.
We have St. Martin's Day, Portugal, England, and then interestingly, the northern parts of the Netherlands. So north of the Rhine, they celebrate St. Martin's Day. South of the
Huh.
Rhine, where I grew up, we do not. It's celebrated on November 11th with traditional foods like roasted chestnuts, and it features ancient rituals such as jumping over fires thought to protect against witches.
Sure.
There's lantern walks, and yeah, so it showcases pre-Christian traditions alongside with the Catholic Saint Day celebration.
That feels a little animist to me as well, because it's the time of year where it's getting colder, where,
Mhm.
those areas, Portugal, England, north in the Netherlands, the fire rituals and
Mhm.
looking at, the warmth and the heat. A lot of that feels animist to me as well.
Absolutely. In some regions of Belgium, like in the town of Stavelot, Whit Monday is celebrated with religious processions that include local folklore characters alongside more traditional Christian figures. And this reflects a medieval tradition that continues to evolve to this day.
Oh, what fun.
Yeah, so fun. And in Poland and Ukraine, we have Kupala Night, which is the night of June 23rd or 24th. And so it's like before St. John's Day. This is a Slavic holiday, but it's the night before the feast of St. John the Baptist. But it includes pre-Christian elements like bonfires, fertility rites, water rituals, and it's a very clear reflection of pagan roots in celebrating the summer solstice. I couldn't get away but mention the Feast of St. Nicholas, December 5th, which is kind of the Dutch Christmas. It's when most kids get their presents.
Oh,
It's now largely secular and it's known as Sinterklaas. Like everybody celebrates it. I think Jehovah's Witnesses do not celebrate it, but pretty much everybody else does. And Sinterklaas, the Dutch colloquial form of Saint Nicholas, he influenced American Santa Claus. It still, and especially in the South, so when we celebrate Saint Nicholas Eve, December 5th, but then December
mhm.
6th is officially Saint Nicholas's death day, so that's his feast day. And especially in the
Okay.
South, where people are more Catholic than in the North, there's still a lot of religious celebrations around that as well.
Now, you mentioned earlier that there are some different types of folk Catholicism that are very specific. Maybe we can go into a little more detail on those.
Yeah, that's great. Let's do that. So I already mentioned voodoo from Haiti. It's a syncretic religion that blends elements of West African religions brought to Haiti by enslaved Africans, and it blends it with Roman Catholic Christianity. It involves the worship of spirits known as the Loa, who are often synchronized with Catholic saints.
Sure.
Voodoo rituals include music, dancing, spirit possession, and it's like a profoundly spiritual and cultural practice for the people that follow it.
I found it interesting that the word voodoo itself is derived from a word from Yoruba that means
Mhm.
spirit and is linked to demonology beliefs of Catholicism. You see that a lot in like what we can see of the practice, that there are, a lot of demonology beliefs in the practice. So I thought that was fascinating.
For sure. And then we have candomblé. It's an Afro-Brazilian religious tradition that also syncretizes African religious practices with Catholic elements. And like voodoo, its practitioners worship a pantheon of deities that is akin to the Yoruba Orishas. Each are associated with a Catholic saint. The rituals are elaborate. They involve drumming, singing, dancing, and offerings to the Orishas.
Huh.
And then we have Santeria, which is, I think maybe in America, people are a little bit more familiar with because it's practiced quite a bit here, actually, especially in larger cities. It's another Afro-Caribbean religion that emerged from the syncretism of Yoruba spirituality and Catholicism. Santeria honors Orishas with rituals similar to those in Candomblé, but adapted to a Cuban context. Santeria honors Orishas with rituals similar to those in Candomblé, but it's adapted to a Cuban context. And it includes the use of altars, ritual music, dance, animal sacrifice, and divination.
So interesting.
We have Italian folk Catholicism, which is an interesting one because I see that seems to be pretty popular in the US these days, and especially for people of Italian heritage. They're really kind of looking back to Italian folk Catholicism for, to rediscover their roots.
Mhm.
To the Italian peasantry, the presence of the sacred was associated with rites of traditional magic called the Benedictaria. This form of magic was practiced by La Strega, like witches is how that's translated.
Mhm.
And they combine the knowledge of herbs, formulas, and spells with the sacraments of the church and their prayers.
It's interesting. I have a friend who actually identifies, it's called Lestrade. Is that how you pronounce it?
I think so, yeah.
Yeah. And she's like, that's what I am. And so I think that that's interesting that you mentioned that it is popular here because
Yeah.
I just happen to know someone who does practice that.
Yeah. In the Middle Ages already, there was like a pretty vocal part of the populace that was like still practicing that. And we have records not just from prosecution, but also in other contexts. So that's interesting.
Very interesting.
Ireland also has a very rich heritage, and it was interesting because they were converted pretty early on. Sacred wells are scattered throughout Ireland and are visited by people seeking bodily cures. The holy wells contain water blessed by a Catholic priest or bishop and are usually dedicated to one of a myriad of native Irish saints. And also, those are often, like for example, St. Bridget, it's pretty clear that that was a pagan goddess before she became a Catholic saint.
Well, and I think a lot of those wells and holy places in the UK are placed in areas that had been considered holy places before
Right.
Christianity came along.
Right.
And so I think that's another alignment that, hey, people have always considered this holy. We're going to just continue that and put the Catholic veneer over it, if you will.
Right. Another very popular practice in Ireland is it's called the breed in order of St. Bridget, and it's a piece of cloth or a ribbon which is left overnight on a windowsill or outside in a tree or so on the eve of the saint's feast day, so before Imbolc or St. Bridget's Day. And the belief is that the saint will pass through Ireland that night and touch the ribbon or the cloth, which is then kept by individuals and venerated as a holy object, which may be used to help the sick or for protection. And that is definitely something that I do every year.
Interesting.
I hang a piece of cloth in our maple tree overnight.
And when do you do that?
The night before St. Bridget's Day, so before Imbolc.
Okay.
I went onto some Reddit groups to find some more information, and I found And it was like just perfect. Like we know so many things about, especially in Europe, about pre-Christian traditions because of the writing of the monks who said, don't do this thing. And also don't do this thing. And if you're a Christian, you should also not do this thing. And that's how we know so many things that people did before conversion.
Interesting.
I collected some of those. So one of them is a St. Joseph statue. You bury a St. Joseph statue upside down in your yard if you're trying to sell your house.
I've definitely heard that one.
The idea behind it is that it's kind of uncomfortable for St. Joseph to be upside down. And so he will help you sell your house really quick because then you'll dig him back up and put him right side back up.
That's hilarious.
There's also a belief that Catholic priests have healing powers, as in faith healing.
Okay.
There is apparently a Saint Bibiana she's the patron saint of people with hangovers. So invoking her or making an offering to her helps with curing and preventing hangovers.
Mm-hmm. I could have used that in my 20s.
Yeah, right. There is this thing that I read about that outside church doors, especially in Mexico and like the southern parts of the US, where you find a lot of fires burning outside church doors and maybe even inside. And that apparently is a holdover from Mayan religion. In Italy and some other places, a town or region's patron saint may correspond to a pre-Christian god that ruled that same area. And there is an interesting snake festival in Italy where people drape a statue of a saint with live snakes. And that was said to be a leftover of early pre-Christian snake goddess veneration, which you see in like all through Neolithic Europe and Mesopotamia and stuff. We had snake and bird goddesses. And among the cartels, apparently, there's a pretty big veneration of Santa Muerta. And then the Sicilian Mafia and its American counterparts do things like burning a saint card with their blood on it to symbolize what will happen to your soul if you rat out the family. And this is one of my absolute favorite. Saint Gunifort, I think is how you pronounce it.
Gunifort?
Yeah, I think something like that. The cult of this dog saint persisted for several centuries until the 1930s, despite the repeated prohibitions of the Catholic Church.
Where was that? Do you know?
France, maybe.
It's interesting because like there's the black shuck.
Sure.
Is still a big folk belief there. People still believe in that is a protector. And so I think that there having been a dog saint is an interesting kind of parallel.
Yep. It is French, 13th century, and he was a greyhound.
Mm-hmm. Oh, interesting. Okay.
So that's pretty much what I have for this episode on folk Catholicism. Did you have anything else to add?
Well, let's talk about a little bit of folkloring for people and things that they can do at home before we wrap it up.
Absolutely. So one of the things that you can do is pay attention to Mother Mary, the Virgin Mary, Holy Mary, potentially historical figure, and as a saint, and as a potential goddess figure. There seems to be a lot of information out about that. A lot of people who are not Catholic are praying rosaries and things like that.
Sure.
So you can definitely look into that. You can pick up a psalm and see if it has any sort of effect on you or in your particular practice. The use of Christian psalms has a long history, especially in Europe and European diaspora when it comes to being used in magical practices. I personally really like Psalm 23. It's the Psalm of David. And I don't use it in spell work or anything like that, but every once in a while I'll just say it, and it seems to have a really calming effect on my nervous system.
I use that one if I do a full moon ritual, which I don't always get around to, but I really like it. And I usually repeat it 3 times. And I don't say the Lord is my shepherd, I say the goddess. But for whatever reason, it always moves me and I tear up a little bit. And I have a list. I took a class a few years back of different practices and rituals that
Mhm.
you can do. And I'm going to go through a very short list of different psalms and what you can use them for based on the symbolism within.
That's awesome.
As I said, I do the full moon ritual with Psalm 23, and that is always a road opener for me
Uh-huh.
when I'm wanting to draw things into my life, make the way easier.
Right.
Psalm 5 is like for general personal protection. Psalm 7 is also can be used for protection, but more of a return to sender. So if you know that somebody is sending bad energy or evil thoughts your way, Psalm 7 can be used to return that energy back to them.
Uh-huh.
Psalm 10, again, a protection spell. A lot of these are protection, but this is more for justice or the correct outcome to occur.
Right.
Psalm 51, it can be used for spiritual cleansing. And Psalm 54 can be used for protection against magical attack, but more in a general way than the return to sender.
Huh.
Yeah, Psalm
Right.
57 can be used for general energetic cleansing.
That's awesome. I'm gonna have to look some of these up after we're done recording. So another thing you can do is read up on some saints who were probably just gods or spirits in disguise, or maybe even one of your ancestors. And that was funny for me when I started being more interested in looking at my family tree. It turns out that my great 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 aunt is Saint Gunigunde. She was she's the patron saint of Luxembourg.
That's amazing.
Yeah, it was fun.
And as I said earlier, you can get oracle decks based on saints and use those. I don't use those as much as I use my favorite deck, but yeah, you can absolutely look
Mhm.
those up. And I probably got mine at the local occult shop, but I'm sure you can get
Uh-huh.
them online.
Sure. There is things that people who are not Catholics can get from the Catholic Church if you feel so inclined, without that being appropriative or disrespectful. I went and checked. You can get your candles blessed on Candlemas, which is February 2nd. You can get holy water. And there's other, like October 4th is St. Francis's Day. You can bring your animals to get blessed. And I'm sure there's many other things that you could do as a Christian Catholic.
It's interesting because when we were talking about this, I thought, I'm going to do the research. And so I jumped on to Amazon. And yes, you can, in fact, get your holy water on Amazon if you choose to do that.
That is crazy. I personally went to Chimayo in New Mexico, which is a tiny little, very old Catholic church where there's like a dirt floor in one of the little side
Mhm.
sanctuaries. And that dirt is supposed to have healing properties. And so the whole little chapel is hung full of crutches and glasses, people's eyeglasses, and things like that. And it's yeah,
Interesting.
a lovely, lovely little place. And you can take some of the
Oh, cool.
Yep.
I think that also just churches and church, graveyards in general have so much rich symbolism
Yep.
on the headstones and the mausoleums and inside the churches, the carvings. The symbolism is crossover from pagan beliefs and older religious beliefs. And just being able to walk through and experience that, particularly in Europe, there's just like, that's one of the main activities when I go visit is I'm going to go check out the
Yep.
local churches. And even the beautiful stained glass and all of it is just so fascinating that if you have an opportunity to go, and I even go to the local churches around here because often they're open and it's beautiful and it's peaceful and it's easy to do, and a lot of them are open to the public when it's appropriate to be open and people can just come and sit and enjoy that atmosphere. So that's an easy thing to do as well.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. When you talked about the symbolism in churches, especially like the early and medieval churches that you still see in Europe a lot, filled with pagan symbolism, which I always find like so interesting.
Yeah, it's amazing. And there's tons of books. I mean, that would be a whole deep dive in and of itself onto what all of that symbolism means and how it developed over time. And it's a fascinating topic that I've had an opportunity recently to be researching, and it's just amazing all of the meaning within all of those different symbols.
For sure. So I think we've come to the end of our episode. I hope we've given you some ideas if you wanted to dip your toe into the practice of folk Catholicism. If you enjoyed this episode, please give us a 5-star rating and follow along on whatever podcast device you're listening to this on. And yeah, check us out on Instagram, and we hope to see you next time.
Thanks, everyone, and keep folkloring. As always, thanks for listening to Folkloring. If you liked what you heard, please consider giving us a rating and review, and don't forget to subscribe on your favorite podcast app so you never miss an episode. If you have any questions or comments, or would like to suggest a topic for a future episode, please email us at folkloringpod@gmail.com or message us on Facebook or Instagram. You can find Tanya at Folklore Home Companion on Instagram, where she writes about European folklore and traditional life. You can find Tracy at the Folklore Podcast as the theater, film, and storytellers correspondent and producing the Stories from the Hearth podcast. Hope to talk to you again soon.